Good afternoon. I'm Dr. Mark Andrew Holochek. You know me, I'm Thomas Jefferson scholar, philosopher, and historian, and been away for a while visiting a friend in Cody, Wyoming, with another friend, Cowboy Chuck. And well, try to make up for that and do another video here. This one is on Thomas Jefferson's summary view of the rights of British America, which I think is a much neglected view. And the argument I want to make is that this is an atypical work of Thomas Jefferson. This is Jefferson writing as a Southerner, and I'll explain in a bit what I mean by that, not an American or cosmopolitan, which he tends to do most of the time. In 2022, I published a work for the Abbeville Institute titled Jefferson's Textured Republicanism. And in that writing, I examined several letters of Jefferson on the notion of the differences between Federalists and Republicans. And Jefferson reduces those differences, perhaps strangely, to certain constitutional, i.e., physical differences between Federalists and Republicans. And Republicans, i.e., Whigs, are Saxon sympathizers. Federalists, i.e., Tories, are Norman sympathizers. Now, he talks of this rather in great detail in a letter to his friend Marquis de Chastellux on September 2, 1785. And he gives a laundry list of the differences between the two. He says, while Northerners are cool, sober, and chicaning, inter alia, Southerners are fiery, voluptuary, and candid. Each has one thing in common: both are liberty loving. And that should come as no surprise given that Northerners and Southerners needed to come together to fight the Revolutionary War. Now, the features, the fieriness, the voluptuariness, and the candidness are underscored, I want to argue, in his summary view in 1774. And they're missing, or relatively so missing, from his Declaration of Independence 2 years later. So the summary view, I argue, is fiery, voluptuary, and candid, while the Declaration is cool, sober, and though not chicaning, it's at least not as candid as his summary view. Now, if that is correct, then the summary view, as far as my argument goes, is a typically Southern document, while the Declaration of Independence is an American document, if not a cosmopolitan document. When the British closed the port of Boston in 1774 because of the Boston Tea Party on December 16, 1773, Jefferson was just 30 years old at the time. And he did his part, insofar as he could do his part, for the colonial American cause by doing what he does best, i.e., writing. So he crafts this 7,000-word list of complaints directed at the King of England, George III, concerning Americans' contravened rights, right? That was the same year that Jefferson purchases his 157-acre tract of land on which the Natural Bridge sits. Now, Jefferson begins the summary view by calling his document, or miscalling, as it were, humble and dutiful, a humble and dutiful address to lay before the king certain complaints of the subjects of the king. He takes himself as an emissary or representative of the colonial Americans. Now, the document might be dutiful in Jefferson's words, but it's far from humble. Jefferson here is angry. He is in George's face, right? He begins by putting into place the king. He addresses the king as an equal citizen, not as a superior. George is merely primus inter pares, in Latin for first among equals, someone who just happens to be a ruler, but though he has no status, special status over the other people. Okay, the king is nothing more, and here I quote, than the chief officer of the people appointed by the laws and circumscribed with definite powers to assist in working the great machine of government erected for their use, and consequently subject to their superintendence. Consequently, one might argue that no citizen ought to grovel before the king. Jefferson writes here truthfully, and what he writes is, in his own word, divested of those expressions of servility. Jefferson's being bold here, bit of a badass. Now, the main body of the writing is a lengthy articulation of the many, quote, unwarranted encroachments and usurpations, right? It's similar in that regard to his Declaration of Independence. Jefferson writes, scarcely have our minds been able to emerge from the astonishment into one stroke of parliamentary thunder has involved us before another more heavy and more alarming is fallen on us. Single acts of tyranny may be ascribed to the accidental opinion of a day, but a series of oppressions begun at a distinguished period and pursued unalterably through every change of ministers too plainly prove a deliberate, systematical plan of reducing us to slavery. That is a sentiment, that last sentence, which I read, is a sentiment that is cleanly, less lengthily expressed in his Declaration of Independence. So, without question, Jefferson is patterning, in some instances, his declaration after the summary review. Now, here I want to offer just a few instances of some of the abuses. Jefferson talks about numerous coercive acts passed by the British Parliament, including, among other things, the Stamp Act, with which we're all familiar, an act suspending the legislature of New York, an act for duties on tea, and an act for the suppression of riots and tumults in the town of Boston, more rioting. That's just not even a handful of some of the complaints Jefferson has. Now, the king has acted as if the rights of the colonists were the gift of the chief magistrate and not derived from the laws of nature. They're given by nature, and what nature gives, the king cannot negative. Now, Jefferson says at the end of his document that God, who gave us life, gave us liberty at the same time, and the hand of force may destroy, but it cannot disjoin them. Now, we find Jefferson here sufficiently bold-faced. That's the Southerner in him, and it doesn't hurt that he's an ocean apart, some 3,000 miles apart from the king. He advises the king on how it is that a king ought to act, as primus inter pares, as the first among all the citizens. George III has the power of negativing any act, but for the most trifling reasons, he has refused to do so. Slavery foremost among them. And here is the passage on slavery. The abolition of domestic slavery is the great object of desire in those colonies where it was unhappily introduced in their infant state. But previous to the enfranchisement of the slaves we have, it is necessary to exclude all further importations from Africa. Yet our repeated attempts to effect this by prohibitions and by opposing duties which might amount to a prohibition have been hitherto defeated by His Majesty's negative, thus preferring the immediate advantages of a few British corsairs to the lasting interests of the American states and to the rights of human nature deeply wounded by this infamous practice. Now, Jefferson is putting the blame on the king, is that, there have been attempts to prohibit further importation of slaves from Africa, and yet the king has negated any attempts to prohibit importation of slaves. All right, so in effect, Jefferson's arguing that the king has reduced the colonists, the colonial Americans, to feudal serfs. I quote from him again. He says, a general principle indeed was introduced that all lands in England were held either immediately or immediately of the crown. But this was borrowed from those holdings which were truly feudal and only applied to others for the purposes of illustration. America was not conquered by William the Norman, nor its lands surrendered to him or any of his successors. right? In effect, what Jefferson's arguing is that the colonial lands are illoyal, not owned by the king. All right. America's colonists, America's ancestors, colonial ancestors, were acting, says Jefferson, on a right that was granted by nature of departing, and I'm quoting here, departing from the country in which chance, not choice, has placed them, of going in quest of new habitations, and of their establishing new societies under such laws and regulations as to them shall seem most likely to promote public happiness. End of quote. Jefferson adds that when the first waves of colonists arrived in the New World, not a shilling, says he, was ever issued from the public treasures of his majesty or his ancestors for their assistance, till of very late times after the colonies had become established on a firm and permanent footing. What Jefferson is referring to here is the enterprise of growing the right sort of tobacco in America to make the venture of colonizing America profitable. Only when that had the colonial settlers had been turning a profit, did the king show any interest in what the colonists were doing, right? So if he begins by putting George in his place, he ends in the same manner, very boldly. He commences by asserting American fearlessness. Let those who flatter fear it's not an American art. To give praise which is not due might be well from the venal, from the corrupt, but it would ill beseem those who are asserting the rights of human nature. Right? If one is arguing from something given to us by nature, the king is trying to trump that, trump God and nature itself. Jefferson continues, kings are the servants, not the proprietors of the people. The whole art of government consists in the art of being honest. Only aim to do your duty, and mankind will give you credit where you fail. No longer persevere in sacrificing the rights of one part of the empire to the inordinate desires of another, but deal out to all equal and impartial right. Again, Jefferson is castigating the king. He's advising. It's a 31-year-old man telling the king how a king should do his business. George III is then advised to open his breast to liberal and expanded thought, right? As if he's conservative and closed-minded. The verdict of history on the reign of George III, let not the name of George III be a blot in the page of history, depends very likely on the king obeying the advice of his, what Jefferson calls himself here, the Great American Council. Fame and future felicity are at stake. Now, how can we sum, what can we say of this remarkable, this audacious document? As I stated already, there's nothing like it in Jefferson's other political writings. It's a young Jefferson, it's a bold and brash Jefferson. It is the summary view is through and throughout an indignant writing. In my own opinion, Southerners, from having lived in the South for some 8 years, are not quick to anger. They take their anger too seriously and they wish it to be fully justified. But when they do become angry, they express their anger artfully, unremorsefully, thoughtfully, and unequivocally. Jefferson, in the summary view, he's artful, unremorseful, thoughtful, and without equivocation. He's all of those things. This is perhaps the only political document where he aims to express political gripes and what are to him universal truths in a manner that is typically Southern. Jefferson, in his summary view, is not an American or cosmopolitan ambassador for liberty and equality. Thomas Jefferson is a Southern ambassador. I hope you enjoyed the talk, and next week I'll be back with my co-conspirator Donna Vitek to do another show on a different topic. This is Dr. M. Andrew Holacek saying TTFN. Ta-ta for now.